On an October morning in 1961, a 29-year-old farmer named Walter Greer drove his grain truck to the elevator in Caldwell County, Kansas, and did something that everyone who saw it remembered for the rest of their lives. He drove past the line. There were 11 trucks ahead of him, all of them loaded with wheat from the fall harvest, all of them waiting to unload at the price the elevator was posting that morning, which was 1.84 cents per bushel. Good price, fair price. The kind of price that made October feel like it had delivered on its promises. Walter drove past every one of them, turned around at the far end of the yard, and drove home with his load still in the truck. The elevator manager, a man named Dale Forsythe, watched from the scale house window. He had seen a lot of things in 20 years of running an elevator. He had never seen a man drive all the way to town with a full load and then drive home without unloading. He called out the window to the driver of the first truck in line, a farmer named Roy Hatcher. "What's wrong with Greer?" Roy watched Walter's truck disappear down the highway. "Don't know. Maybe he changed his mind about selling." Dale looked at the departing truck. "The price is fair. It's a fair price." Roy shrugged. Apparently not fair enough for Walter. Dale went back to his scales. He figured Walter would be back tomorrow, or the day after, maybe the week after, when he needed the cash to pay his fall bills. Walter Greer did not come back in October. He did not come back in November. He did not come back in December. The price went up in January. It went down in February. It went up again in March. On the 14th of April, 1962, Walter Greer drove his grain truck back to the Caldwell County elevator and unloaded at 231 cents per bushel. The same wheat, the same truck. 6 months later, 47 cents per bushel more than October. On 11,000 bushels, that was $5,170. From the same crop. Dale Forsythe processed the transaction without saying anything. Then he watched Walter drive away and thought about what he had just witnessed. He did some arithmetic on the back of a deposit slip. He did the arithmetic twice. Then he called his wife and told her that the Greer farm had just made more money by not selling in October than most farmers made by selling everything they had. Let me tell you about Walter Greer before we go any further. Because the decision he made that October morning was not a decision he made that morning. It was the conclusion of something that had started 11 years earlier, in the kitchen of his father's farmhouse, on an evening in 1950 when Walter was 18 years old, and his father Raymond spread a stack of papers across the kitchen table. Raymond Greer had been farming 320 acres in Caldwell County since 1927. He was a careful man, methodical, the kind of farmer who wrote things down not because he was required to, but because he believed that a man who could not account for what he had done could not understand what he should do next. What Raymond spread on the table that evening was 10 years of price records. Every week for 10 years, he had written down the price the elevator was paying for wheat, barley, and corn. He had gotten the numbers from the bulletin board at the elevator, where they posted the weekly cash prices, and he had copied them into a ledger that he kept in the kitchen desk. He showed Walter the pattern. "Look," he said, "every year, same thing. Prices hit the bottom in October, when everyone is selling. Then they climb through the winter. Then they come back down in July when the new crop reports start coming in. Same every year." Walter looked at the charts. He could see it clearly. The October valleys, the March peaks. The pattern repeats like a tide. He said, "Why does everyone sell in October then?" Raymond said, "Because they have to. Because they have bills due and equipment notes and operating loans that come due in the fall. The bank wants its money in November, and the only way to have money in November is to sell in October, no matter what the price is." He looked at his son. "That's why I don't borrow." He said it simply, the way he said everything important. Because a man who owes money in the fall has to sell in the fall, and a man who has to sell in the fall sells at the worst price of the year. Walter thought about that for a long time. He said, "So if you don't owe money, you can sell whenever you want." Raymond nodded. "You can sell when the price is right, instead of when the bank says so." Walter said, "Does anyone do that?" Raymond said, "Not many." He looked at the charts again. Not many have the storage, and not many have managed to stay out of debt long enough to have the freedom to wait. He closed the ledger. "I've been storing grain since 1947, he said, selling in the spring instead of the fall. It works. Not every year is perfect, but over time it works. The numbers say it works." Walter was 18 years old. He was sitting at his father's kitchen table looking at 10 years of carefully documented evidence. He did not know yet that he was looking at the operating principle of his entire farming life, but he was. Raymond Greer died in 1959 when Walter was 27. He left the farm to his son, along with the 320 acres, the equipment, and the kitchen desk with the 10-year ledger inside. He also left 2 grain bins, steel Butler bins, 6,000 bushels each, built on concrete pads behind the main barn. Raymond had bought them in 1947 and erected them himself over 2 weekends. He had told Walter they were the most important investment he had ever made. "More important than the land? The land grows the crop," Raymond said. "The bins determine when you sell it. The timing of the sale is where most of the profit lives." Walter had watched his father fill those bins every fall and sell in the spring for as long as he could remember. He had watched the neighboring farmers sell in October at whatever price the elevator was offering, and then spend the winter talking about what they should have gotten. He had heard 100 conversations at the feed store and the diner about how the prices always seemed to be better after harvest, how the market never gave you a fair shake in the fall. Nobody connected this to the fact that they were all selling at the same time. That 11 trucks in line at the elevator on an October morning was exactly the reason the price was what it was. Supply and demand in its most basic form, happening right in front of everyone, invisible to almost all of them. Walter connected it. He had been looking at his father's charts for 11 years. When he took over the farm in 1959, the first thing he did was build 2 more bins. 4 bins total, 12,000 bushels of storage, enough to hold his entire crop and weight. The second thing he did was make a rule. The rule was simple and came directly from his father's observation. Sell when the price reaches 20% above the October harvest price, or sell by April 15th, whichever comes first. No exceptions, no waiting for more, no trying to find the absolute top, 20% or April 15th. He wrote it on a card and taped it to the inside of the kitchen cabinet where he kept his price ledger. He never needed to look at it. He knew it by heart from the day he wrote it. Let me tell you about the first 10 years, because the first 10 years were when Walter earned the reputation that defined him for the rest of his farming life. From 1959 to 1969, Walter Greer never sold a bushel of grain in October, not once. He harvested in the fall, loaded his bins, dried the grain to save moisture with an aeration system he had built himself from box fans and perforated pipe, and waited. He tracked prices every week, the same way his father had tracked them, calling the elevator on Monday mornings and writing the number in his ledger. He watched the seasonal pattern that his father had charted repeat itself with the consistency of something governed by laws rather than preferences. October low. November is slightly better. December is steady, January climbing, February higher, March and April the peak. The same tide, moving the same way, year after year. In good years, the spread between October and his selling date was 30 or 40 cents per bushel. In volatile years, it was $1 or more. In the flattest year of the decade, 1966, the spread was 11 cents. On 10,000 bushels, that was $1,100. Not dramatic, but $1,100 for doing nothing except waiting. The county thought he was odd. Not in a mean way, not at first, just odd. The way a man is odd who does something different from everyone else and who is not bothered by being different. Dale Forsythe at the elevator told people about the October morning when Walter had driven past the line with a full load and gone home. The story became part of the local fabric. Walter Greer, who never sells in October. Walter Greer, who stores his grain and sells in the spring. Walter Greer, who thinks he knows better than the market. What Dale Forsythe did not tell people, because he did not know until years later when Walter finally told him, was that the decision to drive past that line in October 1961 had not felt particularly brave or radical at the time. It felt like following a rule. The rule was simple, and the rule made sense, and the rule came from a ledger full of price charts that his father had kept for 10 years, and that Walter had been studying since he was 18 years old. Walter was not defying the market. He was reading it. The market said October was the worst time to sell. The market said this every year, in the October prices compared to the March prices, in the data that had been available to anyone who had bothered to look at it since before Walter was born. Walter had bothered. That was all. Roy Hatcher, who had been first in line on the morning Walter drove past, had a different way of seeing it. He told the story at the diner every October for 20 years as a cautionary tale about a man who thought he was smarter than the market. Roy never changed his opinion. He sold in October every year, partly because his loan payments were due in November, and partly because selling in October was what you did and what had always been done, and what made sense to him in a way that storing grain and waiting for a spring price did not. Walter and Roy had been neighbors for 30 years. They liked each other. They helped each other during planting and harvest and the emergencies that farming produced. They just had a fundamental disagreement about when to sell grain that neither of them had ever resolved through argument because they had never argued about it. They had simply each continued doing what they did year after year, and the market had continued rewarding Walter's approach and not rewarding Roy's, and neither of them talked about it much. Roy died in 1991, owing the First National Bank of Caldwell County $40,000. His son sold the farm to cover the debt. Walter attended the funeral. He did not think about the $40,000 or the farm sale or the difference between October prices and spring prices. He thought about the 30 years of being neighbors and the times Roy had shown up with equipment when Walter's had broken down at the wrong moment, and the particular quality of a man who is generous with his time and his labor even when he is not generous with his thinking. He thought that Roy had been a good neighbor and a poor marketer. Both of those things were true at the same time. The John Deere dealer in Caldwell, a man named Harlan Pruitt, had the most consistent thing to say about it. He said it at the diner and at the feed store and at the county fair and at every gathering where the subject of grain marketing came up. He said Rudy Stenland up in Minnesota does the same thing, and I'll say to Walter what I'd say to him. You can't time the market. You can be lucky for a while, but eventually the market's going to move the wrong way and you'll be sitting on grain that's worth less than harvest price and you'll have gained nothing except a year of worrying about your bins. People nodded. It sounded right. It sounded like the kind of thing a knowledgeable man would say. It was also, year after year after year, wrong. Let me tell you about math, because the math is where the story lives. From 1959 to 1999, 40 years, Walter Greer never sold a bushel of grain at harvest price. His rule held through good years and bad years, through drought and flood, through the farm crisis and the recovery and the quiet years that followed. 20% above October price or April 15th. In some years the 20% came in January. In some years it came in March. In the flattest years it never came, and he sold on April 15th at whatever the market was offering. In 37 of the 40 years, his spring selling price exceeded his October harvest price. The 3 years it did not, the shortfall was small, 11 cents in 1966, 8 cents in 1969, 14 cents in 1988. Even in those years, the storage cost was low enough that he broke even or came close. 37 out of 40 years, the spring price was higher. The cumulative difference over 40 years, calculated from Walter's own ledger using his own numbers, was $162,000. That was the additional income, above what he would have received selling at harvest price, that Walter Greer earned by waiting. $162,000 from the same crops, the same fields, the same harvests. Just a different date on the check. Harlan Pruitt at the John Deere dealership had no idea. Nobody in the county had any idea. They saw Walter farming the same 320 acres, driving the same used equipment, living in the same farmhouse his father had built. They assumed he was getting by the way a careful farmer got by. Modest, steady, nothing remarkable. Nobody saw the ledger. Nobody saw the column of numbers that grew every spring when Walter made his call to the elevator and the price was where his rule said it should be. Nobody saw the savings account. By 1980, it held $230,000. Now let me tell you about 1980. Because 1980 is when Walter's system was tested in a way that the previous 20 years had not prepared anyone for. The farm crisis arrived in Caldwell County like a slow flood. Interest rates that had been manageable became impossible. Land values that farmers had borrowed against collapsed. Commodity prices dropped to levels that hadn't been seen in years. Farmers who had expanded in the good years, who had borrowed to buy more land and better equipment and larger operations, suddenly found themselves in a position that the contracts they had signed were very specific about. The bank wanted its money. The bank wanted it now. And there was only one way to get money in November, which was to sell grain in October at whatever the elevator was offering. The elevator in October of 1982 was offering $2.10 for wheat. Walter's neighbors drove their trucks to the elevator and took the price because they had to. Their loan payments were due. Their interest rates had climbed from 7% to 18%. The math was brutal and simple. Sell in October or default in November. Walter stored his grain. He sat on 14,000 bushels of wheat through October, November, December. The price moved sideways, $2.05, $2.15, $2.10 again. The men at the diner watched and waited for Walter to crack, for the market to drop further, for 40 years of unconventional thinking to finally produce the disaster that everyone had always known was coming. In February of 1983, the winter wheat crop in the southern plains was damaged by an unexpected freeze. The market moved overnight. Walter watched his price ledger. February 14th, $3.12. That was his 20%. $2.10 plus 20% was $2.52. He passed that in January, but Walter's rule said 20% above October or April 15th, whichever came first. And he was watching the market rise. He called the elevator on March 2nd. The price was $3.48. He sold everything. 14,000 bushels at $3.48. That was $48,720. If he had sold in October at $2.10, the same crop would have brought $29,400. The difference was $19,320 from the same harvest. While 11 farms in Caldwell County went to foreclosure auction that winter, Walter Greer was depositing $19,000 in additional income that he had earned by doing nothing except not selling when everyone else was selling. The spring of 1983 was when Harlan Pruitt finally drove out to Walter's farm. He had been selling John Deere equipment in Caldwell County for 23 years. He had sold it to farmers who were now in bankruptcy. He had watched the county change in ways that his earlier certainty about equipment and credit and the right way to farm had not prepared him for. He found Walter in the machine shed working on the cultivator. "Walter," Harlan leaned on the shed door. "I've been wanting to ask you something." Walter set down his wrench. "Go ahead." Harlan said, "The last time I looked, you hadn't sold any grain in October since before I started selling here. Is that right?" Walter said, "That's right, since '59. Harlan was quiet for a moment. He had done some arithmetic of his own before driving out. He knew what the October prices had been, and he knew what the spring prices had been, and he had multiplied the difference by what he estimated Walter's annual volume to be. The number he had gotten was large enough that he wanted to hear it from Walter directly. He said, "How much more do you make by waiting?" Walter looked at him for a moment. Then he walked to the office corner of the machine shed where he kept his price ledger. He opened it to the summary page in the back where he tracked the annual figures. He showed Harlan the number. Harlan looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, 23 years I've been telling people you were going to get caught holding grain when the market dropped. Walter said, it dropped twice. 11 cents in 66. 8 cents in 69. I sold on April 15th and came close to breaking even. Harlan said, and every other year. Walter said, every other year the spring was better than the fall, by varying amounts. Sometimes a little, sometimes a lot, but better. Harlan looked at the ledger again. He was thinking about every farmer in the county who had bought a tractor from him on credit, about the loan payments that had forced them to sell in October, about the difference between what they had gotten and what they could have gotten if they had been able to wait. He said the bins made it possible. Walter said, the bins and no debt. You need both. The bins give you a place to put the grain. No debt gives you the freedom to leave it there until the price is right. If you have debt, you have a deadline, and a deadline is the market's leverage over you. Harlan shook his head slowly. I've been selling equipment on credit for 23 years. Every loan I arranged created a deadline. Every deadline forced a harvest sale at harvest price. He looked at Walter. I was part of the problem. Walter said, you were selling tractors. That's your job. Harlan said, my customers needed to wait. I was making sure they couldn't. Walter didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. Harlan left without buying anything. It was the first time he had visited a farm in 23 years without trying to sell something. Let me tell you about the 40 years, because the number matters. From 1959 to 1999, 40 harvests, Walter Greer kept his rule, 20% above October or April 15th. There were years when the rule was easy, when the spring price climbed steadily and the 20% came in January and Walter made his call and sold and the whole thing felt simple and obvious, and why didn't everyone do this? There were years when the rule was hard, when the October price was low and the spring price was lower. April 15th arrived with the grain worth less than it had been in the fall. Those years, Walter loaded his truck on April 15th and drove to the elevator and unloaded at whatever the price was and recorded the loss in his ledger and did not question the rule. The rule worked over time. It did not work every year. He had understood this from his father's charts, from the 2 years in 20 that his father had noted as exceptions. You do not judge a 40-year strategy by its worst year. You judge it by its accumulation. The accumulation was $162,000. And then, in the fall of 1999, something happened that the 40 years had not produced before. The market moved in a way that Walter's rule had not anticipated. Not because the rule was wrong, because the market did something large. The drought that developed through the summer of 1999 was severe across the Central Plains. Not the worst memory, but sustained and widespread in a way that the crop reports made clear by August would significantly reduce the winter wheat harvest across Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. Walter watched the reports with the same attention he had given every piece of market information for 40 years. He watched the futures markets through the county extension office's weekly summaries. He watched the cash price at the elevator begin to move in a way he had not seen before. The October harvest price in Caldwell County in 1999 was $3.20 per bushel. Walter stored his grain, 15,000 bushels in 5 bins, 3 of which he had added over the years as his operation had expanded to 480 acres. November, $3.40, a modest move, normal for November. December, $3.70, stronger than normal. The drought reports were holding. January, $4.15. Walter did his arithmetic. 20% above 320 was 384. He had passed that in December, but he was watching the market do something it had not done in 40 years of his observation, which was moved strongly and consistently upward rather than settle into its usual winter plateau. He did not sell in January. He was watching. His daughter Carol noticed. She had been farming beside him since 1985 and had learned the rule and the patience required by the rule and the particular discipline of watching a price move past your threshold and not selling because something about the market told you the move was not finished. She did not question him, She had watched him operate for 15 years and had learned that the watching he did before he sold was as important as the rule itself. The rule told him the minimum. The watching told him whether the minimum was the right moment. She asked him once, in January of 2000, what he was seeing that made him wait past December. He said, "I'm seeing a market that hasn't found its ceiling yet. The drought reports are still coming in worse than expected. The crop estimate keeps getting revised down. There's no news that would push the price back down." She said, "But the rule said sell in December." He said, "The rule is the floor, not the ceiling. 20% above October is when I must sell. It says nothing about selling at the exact moment I hit 20% if the conditions say the market is still moving." She thought about that. He said, "In 38 years, this is the third time I've watched past my rule threshold because the conditions said to watch. The other 2 times I sold before April 15th at prices higher than December. Once I was wrong by about 15 cents. Once I was right by 30 cents. She said, "And this time?" He said, "I don't know yet. That's why I'm watching." February, $4.60. He called the extension office. They told him the winter wheat condition reports from Kansas and Oklahoma were the worst since 1977. The new crop prospects were poor. The market was pricing in a supply shortage that might last into the following year. He did not sell in February. March, $5.12. He had never seen $5 on wheat in Caldwell County, not in 40 years of watching the market every week. Not once. He checked his rule. 20% above 320 was 384. He was 60% above October's price. His April 15th deadline was 6 weeks away. He called his daughter Carol, who had been farming beside him for 15 years and who would be taking over the full operation the following year. He said, "I think this is the moment." She said, "What do you mean?" He said, 40 years of storing grain and selling in the spring. This is the year the market has moved the way your grandfather always said it could move but rarely does. More than 20%, much more, and it's still moving." Carol said, "What's the rule?" Walter said, "The rule says sell when you hit 20% or April 15th. I hit 20% in December." She said, "But you didn't sell in December." He said, "No, because I was watching something I hadn't seen before." He paused. "I'm going to sell it on Monday. All 15,000 bushels. $5.12. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What did the October price give us?" Walter did the math. $48,000 at October price. Against this, he multiplied 15,000 by 512. $76,800. The difference was $28,800 from the same harvest. Carol said, "You waited 40 years for this." Walter said, "I waited every year. This is just the year where the waiting mattered most." He sold it on Monday morning, drove his truck to the elevator in Caldwell County the same way he had driven it every spring for 40 years, waited in line, unloaded at $5.12 per bushel. Dale Forsythe had retired in 1989, but his son David ran the elevator now and knew Walter the same way his father had known him. David watched the transaction process and thought about the morning 40 years earlier when Walter had driven past the line with a full load and gone home. He said, "Mr. Greer, what do you think about this price?" Walter said, "I think it's the right price for today. That's all a price ever is." He drove home. Let me tell you about what the 40 years added up to, because this is where the story arrives at its final number. Walter Greer's price ledger, the one started by his father in 1950 and continued by Walter from 1959 through 1999, showed 40 years of harvests and spring sales and the annual difference between what he had received and what the October price would have given him. The total, accumulated over 40 harvests, including the exceptional year of 1999, was $194,000. $194,000 in additional income above what he would have received selling at harvest price. From 5 grain bins and a rule. 20% above October or April 15th, whichever comes first. His father's 5-grain bins cost $400 in 1947. His own 2 bins cost $600 in 1959. $1,000 in storage infrastructure. $194,000 in additional income. Walter handed the operation to Carol in the spring of 2000. He kept the ledger. He had been keeping it for 40 years, the same way his father had kept it, the same format, the same columns, the same careful handwriting entering the numbers every week. He showed it to Carol one evening before the transfer was complete. He said, "Your grandfather started this ledger in 1950. He was trying to understand why the market moved the way it moved. Why October was always the worst time to sell and why spring was usually better." Carol looked at the 50 years of weekly prices. She said, "Did he ever figure out why?" Walter said, "Yes. He said it was simple. Everyone sells in October because everyone needs the money in October. When everyone sells at the same time, the price drops. When people are buying in March and April, prices are higher because there's less grain available. Supply and demand, basic," Carol said, "and the bins fix it." Walter said, "The bins and no debt fix it. You can't wait if you owe money in November. The debt forces the October sale. The bins give you the physical ability to wait, but only if you have the financial freedom to wait. Both things have to be true at the same time." Carol nodded. Walter put the ledger back on the kitchen desk. "It's yours now," he said. "Keep writing in it. Let me ask you something before we close. And take your time with it. When do you sell? Whatever it is you have to sell. Your time, your work, your product, your knowledge. When do you offer it to the market? Do you sell when you need to sell? When the bill is due and the pressure is on and the buyer is there with an offer and the alternative is defaulting on something? Do you sell at the price the market offers today because today is when you need the money? Or do you sell when the price is right?" Walter Greer understood that those are different decisions and that the difference between them, over 40 years, was $194,000. He had not done anything miraculous. He had not been smarter than the market. He had not predicted prices or timed anything perfectly. He had set a simple rule, stayed out of debt so he could follow it, and applied it consistently for 40 years. The rule worked not because it was clever, but because it was patient. Most people sell in October because October is when the crop is ready. They confuse the harvest with the sale. They believe those two things happen at the same time. Walter Greer's father had understood in 1947, staring at a price chart on the back of a seed invoice in his truck in the co-op parking lot, that they were not the same event. The harvest was when you gathered the crop. The sale was when the price was right. The months between them were where the profit lived. 5-grain bins, one rule, no debt, 40 years, $194,000. And on a Monday morning in March of 2000, the last time Walter drove his truck to the Caldwell County elevator, he did not drive past the line. He stopped. He waited his turn. He unloaded at the price his rule said was right. Then he drove home, parked the truck, and sat at the kitchen table with his father's ledger open in front of him. The last entry, March 6, 2000. Wheat, 15,000 bushels, $5.12 per bushel. Below it, in Walter's careful handwriting, a single line, 40 years, done.